Okay, we are at 11:05, so I'll begin promptly. So for those of you in the UK, this is 11's. For the rest of you, I believe this will be lunch, so I hope you've prepared something tasty and that we can give you some food for thought that's nourishing and interesting in the next hour. We certainly have some excellent speakers lined up and I can't wait to hear from them. So as this is cafe conversation style, please feel free to keep your video off, relax into the conversations, and if you'd like to share questions or thoughts in the chat, please do so, and I'll pick up on those after each round of conversations and we can put them to our speakers. So kicking us off today to discuss how can we use the future in innovation policy learning, and we heard a little bit from him at the end of the last session. We have Riel Miller, who is Head of Futures Literacy at UNESCO, and he'll be in conversation with Per Koch, who we all met earlier. So Riel and Per, I will leave it to you to kick off.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
And I'm so glad to see you here, Riel. I want to start with a very, very short scenario, to get the discussion started. So I want you, Riel, to imagine that you are working in a Nordic ministry, right? And you've been to the UNESCO Summit of Future Literacy, and you are very enthusiastic about the whole thing because now you heard Riel talking about how to prepare for the future, and there's finally hope for humanity. And so you walk up all the stairs to the top of the building, to the office with the best view, and talk to the Director General. And you present a plan for running a future literacy laboratory in the ministry with people from around, the stakeholders and all that. And she asks you, well, how much time will this be? Well, it's a couple of days, maybe 2 days, maybe, and I need some 10 people from the ministry, and we need some preparation. So I don't know, it can add up, it adds up, but it's worth it. And she says, well, right now, the minister is engaged in a huge sex scandal. The Minister of Finance is pestering me with more documentation about the effect of our policies. The Research Council hasn't delivered on some of the indicators we gave them. And, why on earth should I spend all those days of playing around? It's game, isn't it? Now, we've been there. How do you do? What do you answer to make this person who has some legitimate concerns about, the workday?
Wonderful, Per. Thank you very much. And as I think Per knows, this is a very familiar scenario for me because I've spent most of my career as a designer, meaning somebody who tries to tailor products to clients like ministers. Spent 10 years doing that at the OECD with the International Futures Program as well. So yeah, this is a familiar scenario. And it's funny, my team is actually so we have the team at UNESCO. They're actually asking me, well, what's the template for this moment? And I tend to call it initiation. And the crucial element in an initiation, and I'll probably use a rather maybe some people will see it as a demeaning comparison, but when you try to sell a car, you need a hook. And you need to find out if they're a family car oriented or if they're sports car oriented, or what's going to be the thing that catches the imagination. And your scenario gives me a few indications of kind of the entry points for helping a director general help the minister deal with other ministers. And one of the things that can be quite convincing is the idea of impact, but from a slightly different angle, meaning the conventional mechanisms for assessing impact we're all familiar with them, and you can do them better or worse, and you can spend extra time attempting to pump up your data and test hypotheses and all the rest. But one of the things about futures literacy is that we don't have evidence because you can't collect it yet. In other words, what are the expectations and how are expectations shaping people's perceptions? Now, this to me is really the crux of futures literacy, is that I'm convinced, and I think there's strong evidence to support this, that the way we see the world, what we pay attention to, what we give weight to, in other words, our the identification of variables and then our weighting of variables is highly dependent on the images of the future that we are using. But since we're not very aware of those images of the future, we don't actually understand the interaction between images of the future and perception. Which means, and I think it's pretty obvious for everybody, that if you develop a futures literacy exercise with a ministry on a topic they care about, and you didn't get that far in your scenario, but on a topic they care about, we can actually promise that there will be new evidence about their effectiveness, meaning we will find new ways of understanding how the policies and the relationship between the ministry and the topic, let's say climate change, clean water, gender, how the ministry and its relationship to that topic is functioning on the basis of something that heretofore has been hidden. The way in which the future is being used and the images of the future that people are using. So what I say to the Director General is, you remember how, probably they don't, but how effective statistics were in becoming a bureaucracy? I mean, in this, accounting and statistics are essential to the functioning of bureaucracies. In most of our countries, this happened in the 19th and early 20th century. But there was a time when statistics were a very unfamiliar way of describing the world. Not everything was subject to common denominators and measurement. We didn't have all the techniques that we use today to create statistics. So if you say to a Director General from a technocratic perspective that there is advancements taking place in social sciences and sciences, which have relevance for the technocratic tasks of a ministry, that will enable the ministry to generate information, data, evidence that is going to be powerful and convincing to the minister and to the public, I think you have something you can sell them. Does that provide an answer? One answer, anyhow?
That's one answer, absolutely. In my introduction, I talked about, the institutional limits to how you can develop future literacy within a ministry, or in our case, it's really much about, innovation agencies and research councils and so on. And because you are, as the Director General told you, you have certain deliveries to make based on management by objectives in the Nordic countries, and those objectives are made in the past, etc., etc. So you have a kind of institutional break, if you want. Now, in your latest comment, in the comment field, you pointed out that maybe there's more to it than just, institutional slowness or break. Maybe we are talking about power here, interests. Could you elaborate on that? And on base of that, what do we do with that?
Yeah, I want to say that and here, I'll take one point of view and one tradition. I've been a public servant all my life, basically, my career, so just about 40 years now, as I said, and I take the tradition which says civil servants, international civil servants, have a responsibility to the public. We're not just beholden to politicians or whatever. Obviously, we are directed and shaped, and the values that we have to pursue need to be consistent and congruent with the elected officials. But we also have an obligation to speak truth to power. So one of the things that I think we need to do in today's world, if we take things like climate extinction seriously, and if we take the degree of threat that I think is ambient in terms of fragmentation, the menace of war. Let's put it frankly, or civil war or hatred and all the rest, is to say that we face a situation where, for the most part, human beings are not yet equipped, and I put it very purposefully this way. We are missing a capability. We are illiterate and can be made literate around difference. And I won't go on for very long, but the thing about difference is it's crucial to be able to understand it, to make sense of it, to sense and make sense of it. And there, the reproduction of the past actually inhibits our ability to deal with creativity, with difference that emerges, novelty. And so we have, I think, an obligation here to speak to power and say, look, we're running into a lot of significant threats, and we're seeing tremendous brittleness and fragility in existing systems. We want to innovate, but I think we have to do more than innovate from within the existing systems, because the existing systems have some deep-seated flaws which make difference a problem and which make uncertainty a problem. And since both difference and uncertainty are inherent parts of our universe, and we're not going to get rid of them, we need to be able to enhance our capacity to deal with difference and uncertainty. And this is my answer to your wonderful, wonderful provocation on this, which is that I think in the end, it means that you have to be subversive. And I mean, essentially, it implies a dual path. One which, of course, addresses the need for results-based, outcomes-based certainty, for projecting the past into the future and saying, yes, we can improve health outcomes, we can improve delivery, we can improve safety, we can improve this, etc. But then to also at the same time plant the seeds of empowerment. So this is about power and democracy that allow people to begin to invent their own futures. So begin to source and possess and believe in the futures that they've invented in their context, but also understand that those futures are not just about certainty and colonizing, but also about embracing complexity and uncertainty and becoming more effective at creating difference and dealing with difference. So that empowerment approach, which again, it goes back to the point that I was making about learning to read and write. I mean, it was one of the critiques, of course, that if you teach peasants to read and write, they'll rebel. And then you shouldn't teach them to read and write because they're going to chop off the heads of the royalty. And fair enough. There's a component here to that. But I think that today, those of us who are advocating innovation, those of us who are responsible for helping to advance research, we need to recognize that we live at a very specific period in time. This is our moment in history. It's not 1917, it's not 1946, it's not 1929. It's our moment, 2021, 22, and we have a situation where humanity is the planet is sending humanity a message. We have a situation where our interdependence and interconnectedness is very high. And really a marvelous phenomenon. And we also have an appreciation from a scientific perspective of complexity, which I think obliges us to revise many of our underlying frameworks in order to incorporate complexity into those frameworks. So that's our challenge. And I think it's a very exciting one, but it does require us in some senses to wear two hats.
We have been through some really challenging years now. With great upheavals and increasing political polarization. And one thing is the powers that be, the interest groups and so on, they might push the brake. But you also have this fear among a lot of citizens, a true fear of the future. Some people say that climate change deniers are not really denying climate change, they just don't want to think about it. So it's like, a protective way of reacting to the kind of change that is so challenging, so big that you really don't want to think about it. Could we use future literacy and the thinking around future literacy to build some bridges here?
Yeah, I think Per, you touch on a really crucial opportunity, which is somewhat similar to the opportunity the pandemic has presented, because the pandemic ripped away people's images of the future. You know, your image of the future was I go to the office, and all of a sudden it disappears. And it also demonstrated something that most of us have been talking about for decades now, which is, look at these amazing tools we have. We can do things differently. Why don't we do it differently? You know, I mean, and so all of a sudden, all of that happens. And so you have a moment of, let's say, openness, or a moment when things have relaxed a little bit. But one of the problems, and I think you put your finger on it, is that if you're not equipped, if you don't have the concepts, and if you don't have the habits and the familiarity, in fact, that ends up being a source of panic, and that's a bit what we're seeing all around us, particularly at the political level, kind of panic, and the desire to return to normal and things like that. But the idea of futures literacy, and here I want to go back, I think, in this group to a little bit more of a technical side of things, is that if we are able to distinguish anticipation for the future, which is the planning side of things, and anticipation for emergence, which is the letting go of the past in order to be more open to novelty, we have to recognize that we're doing it on the basis of our history. And I want to be pretty, humble about this, and also in some senses, fairly unhopeful, but I think in a way that is not bad. It has to do with mortality. I don't think I'm going to be able to overcome the fact that I'm anchored in a framework which looks for certainty. In other words, I struggle against it. I look for ways to get over it, but it's in the same way that things like sexism, racism, patriarchy, ways of seeing the world, our relationship to the environment, these are things that require death and the end of things. And so the ability for us to move to a world in which the means are the ends rather than the ends justifying the means, moving to a world in which legacy is lightness instead of heaviness, meaning instead of monuments, instead of continuity, but rather death is the gift of saying, I believe in you, and I know that you will deal with your future, and I'm not going to try and determine what values or what energy you should use, because I don't know best. You know best, because it's your time. That way of seeing things, I think, leads to a kind of a generational perspective to a certain extent, but also to saying there are very significant limits to my ability to really imagine the world differently, because I'm anchored in the language of the past. And I'll stop on this point, is that, my grandparents, all four of them came to North America and did not speak English. And of course, they could never escape that fact that they were living in a world where it was not their mother tongue. And of course, that shapes their perceptions, what they can imagine, what they can do, what they feel, what they see. And I think we're all like that. And so we have to really embrace birth and death, and openness and lightness. And the idea of the greatest gift we can give is to not be, in some senses, a weight on future generations.
I'll come back to the UNESCO Future Literacy Network and the work you're doing at UNESCO. Now, that network is about much, much more than policymaking, and definitely much, much more than innovation policymaking. Yet you have also, both through UNESCO and before that, as a researcher and consultant, worked on anticipation for many, many years. And I wonder, because it will be helpful for many of the people taking part in this exercise to see get some ideas about how this works in practice. Could you give us an example or two about how future literacy has enriched an innovation policy learning process?
Yeah, the great question, and an important one. And so, I can tell lots and lots of stories because I've done hundreds of workshops. But the challenge right from the get-go. So when I designed my first big futures exercise was in 1988 in Ontario. And I noticed how difficult it was for people to be imaginative. and how it was kind of unfair to ask people to be imaginative. So for a long time, I've been seeking ways that allow people to kind of reveal, express their own anticipatory assumptions, which initially are very weak, are very much taken from somebody else. And I just want to, one example, and it's actually, I think it's in the book. We had a fantastic experience on the future of sport with FIFA. And we ran this, the lab, the Futures Literacy Lab in Munich, and it's written up in the book. It's one of the case studies in transforming the future. And it was super, super fun to play with the future, with a whole bunch of managers from the Football League, and talk to them about the future of sport. And just to give you an example of impact. So these are managers managing stadiums and teams and whatnot. And as we went through the process and we unpacked their images of the future and how the images of the future influence their perceptions, they started to realize that they had a significant set of social and value related issues that they weren't dealing with at all, meaning that they had for the most part, and social sciences talk about this, but for the most part, their image of sports didn't include the role of community building and physical health in a way that they could make sense of. And although it seems obvious sometimes for outsiders that if you know Australian and Irish rules football, and you realize the extent to which people are invested in their community and the relationship that it has to sport, or if you the Olympics or whatever it happens to be, for these leaders in their field, their images of the future were preoccupied with doping, with commercial interests, with sponsorship, and they didn't have a way to incorporate into their frameworks the full richness of what sport is all about in their community. So I give that just as a little example, and we built sculptures with them, and we had lots of fun, and they were pretty bowled over by the fact that they could begin to see many things that they hadn't seen before. And I mean, we really have lots and lots of examples like that. I'll give you just one other, just the punchline. I spent 3 days with a financial company that I will not name, looking at their images of the future. And at the end of it, the CEO and the chief financial officer said, "My goodness, we're really ignoring a whole set of greenfield opportunities here that we see are really evident. And not only that, we see they're important." And then you know what they said? "But we're not going to do anything about it because it's not our problem. We're very profitable as we are. Thank you very much. And if somebody does something about this, it'll be another generation or another group of leaders, because we're very happy the way we are. Thank you." So I'm just saying, that this is I feel very, very confident that by providing people with an opportunity to use images of the future and understand the influence of the future on their perceptions, they will be able to ask new questions from their point of view, from their point of departure, and to see the world in a different way. What they do with it is another story.
Thank you so much. We are running out of time now, but I'm going to include a link to your book in the comment field. And I will also just end with a very short story about how that came about. I was working at Innovation Norway at the time, and Anita, which you will meet later on, was my boss. And we had been working with you on developing, using future literacy in Innovation Norway. And I went up to, no, she wasn't up to an office, actually. She was part of the office landscape. So I would just ask her, do you think that we could help UNESCO make this book publicly available? And the answer was very simple, but of course. Thank you very much, Riel.
Yes, and I should thank you, because of course you and Norway and the case study that's in the book are all things that made all of this possible. So a big thank you for the collaboration that's now been going on for years, including other colleagues in Norway who I salute on the call. It's of course with a great deal of gratitude that I'm so happy to work with all of you.
Thank you for kicking us off there. That was a fascinating conversation covering everything from sex, life, death and football. So, you know, I think we've got it all in. But I think the point about, the real point at the end, about stepping out of our own perspectives to see difference and being able to step out of our own power as well. So yeah, really, really thrilling start to our cafe conversations. Thank you. And if you do share the link, we can include that too in our digital digest when we follow up from the event. So I've encouraged everybody to sign up to that, and you'll get extra resources and insights if you do that. So now